Some people think kindness is small, until it costs everything you have. The bill read $18.50. Nothing unusual for most. But for Emily Carter, it was half her tip for the night. And still, she didn't hesitate. She just glanced at the old man sitting across the table, his hands trembling, eyes avoiding everyone, and quietly placed her own cash over the receipt before he could speak. "It's already taken care of, sir," she said softly, not waiting for gratitude, not even looking back, just walking away with that same calm, steady pace, as if nothing had happened. And maybe that's what made it different, because it wasn't charity, it was dignity. And if you've ever seen something like that, the kind of moment that makes you pause and think, you might understand why some stories stay with you longer than others. Why people keep watching, keep listening, trying to catch that one quiet act that changes everything. But Emily didn't know any of that. She just moved on to her next table, adjusting her worn apron, her shoes slightly scuffed from another long shift, her mind already counting how much she'd have left for rent this week, completely unaware that across the room, a man in a perfectly tailored navy suit had stopped mid-sip, his watch catching the light as his gaze followed her, sharp, observant, silent. Daniel Whitmore didn't say a word, didn't call her over, didn't even shift in his seat. But he had seen everything, every detail, the hesitation that lasted less than a second, the way she shielded the old man from embarrassment, the way she chose silence over recognition, and something about that didn't fit into the world he knew, because in his world, nothing was given without expectation, nothing was done without being seen. Yet here she was, disappearing back into the rhythm of the restaurant, as if the moment never existed. And for the first time that night, Daniel wasn't thinking about deals or numbers or the meeting waiting for him in the morning. He was thinking about her, about why someone with so little would give without a witness, not realizing yet that he was the witness that would change everything. The night moved on, but something had shifted, even if only one person had noticed it. Emily continued her routine with quiet precision, balancing plates, refilling glasses, offering small polite smiles that never lingered too long, her movements efficient, almost practiced to the point of invisibility, as if blending into the background was the safest place to be. And for most people in that room, she was exactly that, just another server in a black uniform, part of the setting, nothing more, nothing less. But Daniel Whitmore kept watching, not obviously, not in a way anyone else would catch, just the occasional glance over the rim of his glass, the subtle pause when she passed by, the way his attention returned to her even when his phone buzzed with messages he would normally answer without hesitation, because something about her did not align with the world he understood. And Daniel understood patterns. He built empires on them. People with little protected what they had. They calculated. They hesitated. They held on. But she had done the opposite, and that contradiction stayed with him, growing heavier with every passing minute, until he found himself no longer interested in his meal, his meeting, or the quiet conversations around him. Instead, he studied details, the slight wear on her shoes, the careful way she folded each receipt, the calm expression she held even when a customer snapped their fingers impatiently. There was no resentment in her face, only control, and control like that was never accidental. Across the room, the old man had already left, his chair empty, his presence fading like it had never been there at all, except for the receipt now marked as paid, a small trace of something that should have gone unnoticed, but did not. And just as the rhythm of the restaurant settled back into its usual flow, the manager appeared, his expression tight, his steps quick, scanning the floor until his eyes landed on Emily. "Carter," he called, not loudly, but sharp enough to cut through the ambient noise. And for the first time that evening, she paused, just for a fraction of a second, before turning, her face composed, her posture straight. She walked toward him without hesitation, without question, as if she already knew, and maybe she did, because people like her always did. "There is a discrepancy in Register 3, he said, holding up a receipt, the same one. Daniel recognized it instantly, his fingers tightening slightly around his glass as he leaned back, watching more closely now, not intervening, not yet, just observing, because something told him this moment mattered. "You want to explain this?" the manager asked, his tone controlled, but edged with suspicion, and Emily looked at the paper, then back at him, Her expression unchanged, no panic, no defense, just a quiet stillness that filled the space between them. "I made a mistake," she said simply, her voice steady. And that was it. No elaboration, no excuse, just acceptance. And for a brief moment, even the manager seemed caught off guard, as if expecting resistance, denial, something more. But there was nothing, only that calm admission, and across the room, Daniel felt something shift again, because this was not carelessness, this was a choice, and choices always had reasons, the kind worth uncovering. He set his glass down slowly, his attention now fully anchored to her, realizing that whatever this was, it was only the beginning. There are people who argue when they are accused, and then there are people who stay silent because they already decided what matters more. Emily stood there with her hands loosely folded, her eyes steady, not on the manager, but somewhere just past him, as if she had stepped slightly outside the moment. "A mistake," he repeated, his voice lower now, sharper, trying to find something in her expression that was not there, because people who made mistakes usually looked different. They fidgeted, they explained, they defended themselves. But she did none of that, and that absence of reaction made the situation heavier than it should have been. "You know this comes out of your pay, right?" he added, watching closely, and for the first time, something flickered, not fear, not regret, just a brief calculation, quick and quiet, the kind that happened in a mind used to measuring consequences in dollars and days. "Yes, sir," she said, just as calm. And that was all. No argument, no attempt to correct the story, just acceptance, as if the outcome had already been decided long before this conversation began, and in a way, it had, because Emily Carter had learned a long time ago that some things were not worth explaining, not because they were not important, but because explaining them would cost more than staying silent. She had learned it in hospital waiting rooms where bills arrived faster than answers, in late nights balancing two jobs, and still coming up short, in quiet moments counting cash at a small kitchen table while her younger brother slept in the next room, unaware of how close things were to falling apart. And somewhere along the way, she had made a decision, not out loud, not dramatic, just a quiet rule she followed without thinking. That dignity, once taken from someone, was not something you could give back with words. So when she saw it slipping from that old man earlier, she did not calculate, she did not hesitate, she just acted, because she knew what it felt like to sit there, to feel every eye on you, to wish you could disappear before anyone noticed. And across the room, Daniel watched all of it unfold. The stillness in her posture, the precision in her words, the absence of self-defense, and none of it matched the version of events he had witnessed, which meant only one thing. She was protecting something, or someone, and that realization settled in slowly, like a weight he could not ignore. He had seen generosity before, large donations with cameras present, strategic kindness with contracts attached. But this was different. This was invisible, and now it was costing her, and she was letting it, without resistance, without recognition, as if that had always been part of the exchange. The manager exhaled, clearly impatient now. "Finish your shift," he said finally, folding the receipt. "We will talk about this after closing." And Emily nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible movement, before turning back toward the dining floor, picking up her tray as if nothing had happened, stepping back into the rhythm of service with the same quiet composure. But something had changed, not in her, but in the space around her, because now there was someone watching who understood that what looked like a mistake was actually a choice, and choices like that were never simple. Some moments do not announce themselves. They simply wait to see who notices. The restaurant carried on as if nothing had happened, plates clinking, quiet conversations weaving through the air, the soft hum of a place that never stopped for anyone. And yet, beneath that normal rhythm, something had shifted, because Daniel Whitmore was no longer just a customer finishing his dinner. He was watching with intent now, his attention fixed not on the menu or his phone, but on Emily Carter as she moved from table to table with that same measured calm, as if the weight of what had just happened had not followed her. But he could see it in the smallest details, the way her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of a tray, the fraction of a pause before she turned away from certain tables, controlled, contained, but there, and Daniel had built his life reading details like that, understanding what people try to hide, and the more he watched, the less this felt like a simple mistake. It felt deliberate, precise, almost like she had rehearsed losing something without ever expecting anyone to notice. And that unsettled him more than anything else, because people did not usually accept loss that easily unless they believed it was worth it. After a few minutes, he made a decision, quiet, immediate, the kind that did not require a second thought. As Emily approached his table to refill his water, he looked up, not with the detached indifference she was used to, but with focus, direct and unmistakable. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice calm, controlled, and it stopped her, just slightly, because customers did not usually know her name. Not like that. Not without looking at the receipt first. She met his gaze, professional, steady. "Yes, sir," she replied, already reaching for the pitcher, but he did not look at the glass. He looked at her, studying, measuring. "You handled that situation earlier," he continued, not finishing the sentence, leaving space, as if inviting her to fill it. And for a moment, there was silence, not awkward, not tense, just deliberate. And Emily understood immediately what he was referring to. Of course she did. People like him did not miss things. And yet, her response did not change. "It was a mistake," she said again. The same words, the same tone, as if repeating them could make them true. And Daniel's eyes narrowed just slightly, not in anger, but in recognition, because now he was certain she was protecting the story, not of resistance, because he was used to people responding, reacting, adjusting when he pressed even slightly. But she did none of that. She held her ground without ever raising her voice, without ever stepping out of line, and that made her impossible to read in the way he expected. "Do you always take responsibility for things you did not do?" he asked, the question simple, but pointed, and this time, there was a pause, just a fraction longer than before, her eyes lowering briefly to the table. Then back to him, calm, composed. "Sometimes," she answered, and there was something in that single word, something that did not explain, but revealed enough to make the silence between them heavier, and Daniel leaned back slightly, studying her in a different way now, not as a customer observing a server, but as someone recognizing a pattern he had not seen before, because this was not weakness, this was choice, deliberate and controlled. And just as quickly as the moment formed, Emily stepped back, returning to her role. "Is there anything else I can get for you?" she asked, her tone unchanged, and Daniel shook his head slowly, not breaking eye contact. "No," he said, but his mind was already moving ahead, because whatever this was, it was not over, not for him, not anymore. As she walked away, blending back into the quiet rhythm of the room, Daniel remained still, his untouched glass in front of him, realizing that for the first time that evening, he was not observing a moment, he was stepping into it. The moment you choose silence over truth, you also choose the consequences that follow. The rest of the evening passed with a strange kind of calm, the kind that only existed before something shifted completely, and Emily felt it, not as fear, but as inevitability, because she had seen this pattern before, small decisions that quietly grew into something larger, something unavoidable, and still, she continued her work, clearing tables, refilling glasses, thanking customers, who barely looked at her, holding on to that same steady rhythm as if it could carry her through the end of the night without interruption. But across the room, Daniel Whitmore had already made up his mind. He finished his meal without tasting it, signed the check without looking at the total, and instead of leaving like everyone else, he remained seated. For a moment longer, watching her one last time before standing, adjusting his jacket with the same precision that defined everything he did, and then he walked, not toward the exit, but toward the front counter, where the manager was reviewing receipts. "There was no mistake," Daniel said calmly, placing his copy of the receipt on the counter, his voice low but firm enough to cut through the noise around them. And the manager looked up, confused at first, then cautious, recognizing the kind of presence that did not make idle statements. "I saw what happened," Daniel continued, his tone unchanged. "She paid for a customer who could not afford his meal." And for a brief second, the room seemed to slow, the words settling into the space like something fragile, something that could not be taken back, and the manager's expression shifted, not to understanding, but to discomfort, because this was no longer about a simple discrepancy. It was about being wrong in front of someone who mattered. "That is not our policy," he replied carefully. choosing his words with measured control. But Daniel did not move, did not soften. "Your policy does not change what actually happened," he said, and there was no aggression in his voice, only certainty, the kind that did not need to be raised to be felt. And from across the room, Emily had stopped, just for a moment, her eyes drawn to the counter, to the man who had seen what she never intended anyone to see. And for the first time that night, something broke through her composure. Not panic, not fear, but a quiet realization that the story she had chosen to carry alone was no longer hers to control. The manager glanced between them, the receipt still in his hand, the situation slipping beyond the simple boundaries of his authority. "We can adjust the register," he said finally, his voice less certain now. "No need to escalate this." But Daniel shook his head slightly, not in disagreement, but in refusal to let it end that easily, because this was not about a register, it was about something he could not ignore. "You already did escalate it," Daniel replied, his gaze steady. "When you decided her honesty was a mistake." And that was the moment everything changed, because now the room was no longer moving past the incident, it was holding onto it, watching, waiting, and Emily stood there, caught between the version of events she had accepted and the truth that was now unfolding in front of everyone. And for the first time, she did not step forward, did not speak, because she understood something Daniel did not yet realize, that correcting the truth might cost more than keeping it hidden. Truth does not always save you. Sometimes it exposes you. The air in the restaurant had changed, conversations quieter now, eyes drifting toward the front counter where Daniel stood unmoved and the manager struggled to regain control of a situation that no longer belonged to him. And in the middle of it all, Emily felt something unfamiliar, not fear of losing the job. She had already accepted that possibility the moment she chose to stay silent. But fear of something else, of being seen too clearly, because what Daniel was doing, what he thought was helping, was pulling something into the light that she had deliberately kept in the dark. "Sir, we appreciate your concern," the manager said, forcing a professional tone that no longer held its usual authority. "But this is an internal matter," and Daniel's expression did not change. "It stopped being internal when you made her pay for something she chose to give," he replied. And there it was again, that word, chose, simple, direct, and suddenly heavier than anything else in the room. Emily took a step forward then, not toward Daniel, but toward the manager, her voice calm, steady. "It is fine," she said, and the words landed differently this time, not as acceptance, but as a boundary, and Daniel turned slightly, his attention shifting fully to her, because that was not the reaction he expected, not after what had just been revealed. "You do not have to say that," he said quietly, and for a moment, their eyes met again. But this time, there was something new in hers, not defiance, not gratitude, just a quiet insistence. "I know," she replied, "but I am saying it anyway." And that was when the tension sharpened, because now this was no longer about correcting a mistake. It was about two people choosing different versions of what mattered. Daniel stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You paid for him," he said, as if stating it clearly would change something. "And you are being penalized for it." And Emily held his gaze, unshaken. "No," she answered softly. "I chose to pay, and I chose not to explain." And that subtle distinction hung between them, almost invisible, but impossible to ignore, because for her, this was not injustice, it was consequence, and consequences, once accepted, were not meant to be undone by someone else, even someone like him. And if you were standing there, watching it unfold, you might have wondered what you would do, whether you would speak up like Daniel, or stay silent like Emily, because moments like that reveal more than actions. They reveal priorities, and Daniel was not used to being on the outside of that line, not used to offering help that was not immediately taken. "You are protecting someone," he said finally, the realization forming as he spoke it. And for the first time, Emily did not respond right away, her silence longer now, heavier, because he was close, closer than she wanted him to be, and the manager, sensing the shift, cleared his throat, eager to end what had become something far beyond his control. "This conversation is over," he said, but no one moved, because the real conversation had not even begun yet. And in that suspended moment, Daniel understood something that changed everything again. This was not about money, not about a policy, not even about being right. It was about a choice she was willing to carry alone, and the question that remained, the one that refused to settle, was simple, but dangerous. Why the truth does not arrive all at once. It reveals itself in details people almost miss. Daniel did not step back, but he stopped pushing, and that was new for him, because for the first time, forcing the answer felt like the wrong move. So instead, he watched again, not the situation, but her, the way Emily's hand rested lightly against the counter, steady but not relaxed, the way her eyes flickered just once toward the door, then back. And that small glance, barely noticeable, told him more than any explanation could have. She was not just protecting the past, she was thinking about what came next, and that meant whatever this was, it was not over when her shift ended. "You can go back to your tables," the manager said, his voice tight, eager to dissolve the moment, and Emily nodded, stepping away without another word. But this time, her movement was different, not slower, not hesitant, just aware, as if she could feel that the story had shifted, that someone else was now part of it whether she wanted it or not. And Daniel remained where he was, his eyes following her path across the room, watching how she resumed her work. But now he noticed something else, something he had missed before. The way she checked her phone briefly near the service station, her expression unchanged, but her fingers tightening just slightly around the edge of it before she slipped it back into her apron. And then, moments later, she approached a table near the window, a young couple, quiet, their bill folded neatly at the edge, and for a second, Daniel thought it would be routine, another order, another polite exchange, but Emily paused, just long enough to notice something small, something familiar, and instead of speaking, she adjusted the receipt, her movements precise, deliberate, and then she walked away again. And that was when Daniel understood. This was not the first time. It was a pattern, subtle, hidden in plain sight, repeated so quietly that no one had connected it before. And suddenly, the earlier moment was no longer isolated. It was part of something larger, something she had been doing without anyone realizing. And if you were watching closely, you might start to ask the same question forming in Daniel's mind. How many times had she done this? And more importantly, why? Because people do not repeat sacrifice without a reason. Not like this. Not without something driving it. And as the minutes passed, Daniel's attention sharpened, piecing together fragments, the worn edges of her uniform, the way she never counted tips in front of others, the careful balance between giving and surviving. And then it happened, subtle, almost invisible. Emily stepped into the back hallway for just a moment, thinking no one was watching, but Daniel had shifted slightly in his seat, just enough to catch the reflection in the glass panel near the kitchen door, and through it, he saw her, not the composed waitress from the dining floor, but something else, her shoulders dropping just slightly, her hand pressing briefly against her forehead, and then her phone again, this time longer, her eyes scanning something, reading, absorbing, and even from a distance, he could see the change, not panic, not fear, but urgency, quiet and controlled. And when she stepped back out, she was the same again, composed, steady, invisible. But now Daniel knew, whatever she was carrying did not end at this restaurant. It followed her beyond it. And that meant this story, this choice, this silence. It was only the surface, and somewhere beneath it, there was a reason she was willing to lose more than just a shift. And the only question left was whether that reason would finally come to light, or stay hidden just a little longer. Sometimes the truth is not hidden because it is complicated, but because it is too simple to explain. The restaurant had begun to empty. Chairs slightly shifted, the soft echo of closing time settling into the walls, and Emily moved through it all with the same quiet rhythm, finishing what was left of her shift as if nothing had changed. But Daniel remained, no longer pretending to be just another customer, his attention fixed, patient now, waiting, because he understood something had not yet been revealed. And when the final table cleared and the lights dimmed just slightly, she stepped into the back again, not for long, just enough. And this time, Daniel did not rely on reflections or distance. He followed, not intrusively, not loudly, just enough to see what she thought no one would ever notice. The hallway was narrow, lit by a single overhead bulb, and there, with her back turned, Emily stood still, her phone in her hand, the screen glowing softly in the dim light. And for a moment, she did not move. She just looked at it. And then, quietly, she opened a message, her fingers steady, practiced, and Daniel caught just enough as he paused at the corner. Not the full conversation. Not the entire story, just fragments. But fragments were enough for someone like him. I can cover dinner tonight. Do not worry about it. The message read. Sent hours earlier, followed by another. He said he has not eaten since yesterday. And then, beneath that, a reply, short, simple. You have already done too much, Emily. And she stared at that last line for a second longer than the others. Her expression unchanged, but her silence saying more than any reaction could. And in that moment, everything shifted, because the old man from earlier was no longer just a stranger. He was part of something, part of a pattern that extended beyond a single meal, beyond a single night. And suddenly, the small choices Daniel had been observing were no longer random acts. They were deliberate, consistent, repeated, and more importantly, they were connected. Emily was not reacting to a situation. She was sustaining something, someone, quietly, without recognition, without expectation, and the realization settled heavily, because this was not generosity in the moment. This was responsibility she had taken on without ever being asked. And as she slipped her phone back into her apron, taking a slow breath before stepping back into the light of the dining room, Daniel stepped back as well, unseen, his mind already reconstructing everything he thought he understood, because now the earlier silence, the acceptance, the refusal to explain, it all made sense. She was not protecting a mistake. She was protecting continuity, a fragile balance that depended on no one interfering. And if you were watching this unfold, you might feel that shift too. The moment when the story stops being about one act of kindness and becomes something deeper, something heavier, because now the question was no longer why she paid. It was how long she had been doing it, and what she was sacrificing to keep it going, and more importantly, what would happen if someone like Daniel decided to step in any way some kindness is meant to be seen. But the most powerful kind is the one that refuses to be noticed. The hallway fell quiet again as Emily stepped back into the dining room. The last of the lights dimming, chairs now stacked, the night closing in on itself like it always did, predictable, controlled, and for a moment, it almost felt like everything would return to normal, like the story would end exactly where she intended it to, small, contained, invisible. But Daniel Whitmore did not move toward the exit. He waited, just long enough for her to finish, just long enough for the space to empty. And when she finally reached for her coat, ready to leave as if this had been just another shift, he stepped forward, not abruptly, not forcefully, just enough to enter her world without breaking it. Miss Carter, he said, and she turned, already knowing, because some things did not need to be explained twice, and for a second, neither of them spoke, the silence now different, no longer tense, but understood. You should not have to do this alone, he said quietly, not as a statement, but as an offering, and Emily held his gaze, steady as ever, but softer now, because the truth was no longer hidden between them. I am not doing it alone, she replied, her voice calm, and that answer caught him off guard, not because it was defensive, but because it was complete. He is still here, she added, glancing briefly toward the door, not physically, but in meaning, and Daniel followed the direction of her eyes, understanding that what she had been protecting was not just a person, but a sense of continuity, of dignity, of someone being able to walk in, sit down, and leave without feeling like a burden, without becoming a story people talked about later. And that was when it settled fully. The realization that what she had built was fragile, intentional, and deeply human, something that could not be replaced by a single gesture, no matter how large. If you step in, she continued, her tone gentle but certain, it changes everything. And Daniel exhaled slowly, not in frustration, but in understanding, because for the first time, he saw the difference between solving a problem and respecting a choice, and he nodded once, a small, deliberate movement, before reaching into his jacket, not for a check, not for a card, but for something else, a folded piece of paper, which he placed carefully on the counter between them. Then let me help, your way, he said, and when Emily opened it, her eyes paused, just for a second, not in shock, not in disbelief, but in recognition, Because it was not a number, not a contract, not an offer that would pull her out of the life she had chosen. It was a simple arrangement, a quiet fund, structured in a way that no one would trace back to her. No disruption, no exposure, just support that would exist in the background, the same way she had existed in the lives she helped. And for the first time that night, Emily's composure shifted, not breaking, just softening, enough to show that even strength needed space to breathe. And she looked up at him, not as a customer, not as someone above her, but as someone who had finally understood the rules she lived by. "Thank you," she said. And it was not for the money. It was for the respect. And Daniel nodded once more, stepping back, not lingering, not expecting anything in return, just leaving as quietly as he had arrived. And as the door closed behind him, the restaurant fell into silence again, the kind that held meaning rather than emptiness. And Emily stood there for a moment, the paper still in her hands, before folding it carefully, placing it where no one else would see. And the next morning, when the doors opened again, everything looked the same tables, the same menu, the same quiet rhythm. But somewhere within it, something had changed, not because kindness had been noticed, but because it had been understood, and that was the kind of change that did not need an audience to last.